PanWorks, bringing ethics to life.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second session in our Ethics and Conservation webinar series. My name is Bernie Traversari, and I'm the Director of Operations and Programs for the Society for Conservation Biology North America. So great to have you here today. For those of you that were present last week during our first session, this is a quick reminder that our webinar series is being developed alongside PanWorks, which is a ethics and conservation think tank. One of the co-founders of PanWorks, Bill Lynn, is here today. He actually he was our lead speaker for last week's session. So I'll let Bill talk a bit more about PanWorks and remind everyone what they do. But just to quickly say that SCBNA is really thankful for our collaboration with PanWorks and that we will be working on this series for the foreseeable future. So thank you all so much for being here. Okay, so before we dive into today's session, I always like to do a quick overview of what SCBNA is, what we do, in case folks here are not familiar with our organization. So we are a professional scientific society dedicated to advancing the science and practice of conserving biodiversity. And we look to provide an environment that welcomes, supports, and empowers pretty much everyone involved in conservation. And we attempt to do that in a variety of different ways. We create professional development opportunities like these webinars. We also have hands-on workshops, like I mentioned before we started this meeting. And we cover a variety of different topics, all the way from ethics to politics to conservation education. So that's pretty much the bulk of what we do. We also organize a biannual conference, the next iteration of which is taking place in Milwaukee, Wisconsin next year, July 12th through 16th, and we'll actually be co-hosting for the Society for Ecological Restoration. And then in conjunction with SCB Global, we also manage a number of research publications that anyone can have access to. So I encourage anyone who's interested in that to take a look at those publications and to reach out if you have any questions about those. And I'll mention that I'll include all this information about SCBNA in the chat after I go through this brief introduction. I also always like to encourage folks to join SCBNA if you're not already a member. And this is also a reminder that we now have a free associate membership tier. So great opportunity to try out the society, see if you like to be a part of what we do. And if you enjoy it, then you can take advantage of all the benefits that membership confers. So one more thing that I wanted to mention is that all the things that we do, all the programs that we organize at SCBNA are volunteer-led. We have a number of different standing committees that help develop, coordinate, and implement our programming. And this session, and actually this webinar series, is being developed by our policy committee. Broadly, the goal of the policy committee is to bridge the gap between conservation science and policy. And it attempts to do that in a variety of different ways. We engage with members and chapters to support local advocacy and policy initiatives. We draft, sign on, and submit policy letters and statements of issues that are of input to the society. And we also develop professional development resources like today's series. So if you're interested in learning more about the policy committee, I'll also put a link in the chat. You can go to that link and see all the different activities that we're currently engaged in. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the policy committee, like all of our committees, is led by an amazing group of individuals, including our chair and vice president of policy, Lauren Janitis. If you're interested in being a part of the committee, we are also always on the lookout for new members. So if you enjoy policy, enjoy talking about advocacy, or want to participate in developing programs like today's webinar series or webinar session, then please send an email to the address on the screen. Let us know that you're interested, and we'll be happy to have you. Okay, so before we dive into today's session, I wanted to go through a couple of quick housekeeping items. This should be familiar to folks who were in attendance during last week's session. First thing I wanted to mention is that if you would like to have closed captions for today's presentation, I encourage you to turn them on your end. Unfortunately, even if we turn them on our end as we're recording, those won't show up on the recording. Not sure why that's the case, so I always encourage folks to turn this on your end of the presentation. In addition, I wanted to mention that the chat function is going to be limited for communication only to today's hosts and co-hosts. This is to facilitate the Q&A portion of the session and also to avoid side conversations as we're going through our presentation. In addition to that, I always like to mention that folks are welcome to have their video on or off throughout the entirety of the session. We don't have a preference. Whatever makes you feel comfortable, that's the way to go. And then lastly, the reactions button is also available for folks, primarily to ask questions throughout the session. And we'll have this available as we get into the Q&A for today. Okay, so to talk about this webinar series broadly and to have a quick recap of last week's session and introduce our presenter for today, I'll actually pass it along to Bill Lind, funder of PanWorks.
Well, hello, everyone. It's a delight to be here, and I'm very glad to see many of you who are coming back for this second round. I won't take very much time. Just want to say PanWorks is a think tank dedicated to the well-being of people, animals, and nature. We focus on animals. We're very involved in conservation work. We infuse ethics into both science and policy in order to do this. And if you'd like to know more about PanWorks, please visit us at our website, panworks.io. Other than that, I just want to introduce our speaker and then take a few moments to briefly connect up our presentation from last week with our presentation from this week because they're joined at the hip. Our speaker today is Rebecca Neimeic. She's co-director of the Human Animals Policy Center, as well as associate professor of human dimensions of wildlife at Colorado State University. She has a fascinating presentation on messaging in wildlife protection ballot initiatives, a version of which I've heard before, so I know that I can say it's fascinating, but it really exemplifies what we were trying to get at with last week's presentation. Last week, we talked about the distinction, and it is a distinction, it's not a dichotomy, a distinction between descriptive ethics and normative ethics. Descriptive ethics being primarily an empirical investigation of the norms, the values, the sensibilities that drive conflicts over wildlife, drive conflicts in conservation, and quite frankly, drive public policy in general. And then there's normative ethics, which is more prescriptive. It's more thinking about statements about how we ought to live. The two inform one another. If you're going to understand policy issues, you have to understand the descriptive ethics side of things because those are driving those policy issues. But if you're going to solve those policy issues, you've also got to address the normative ethics sides of matter. And here today, Dr. Rebecca Neimeic is going to talk to us about the descriptive side with its implications for the normative side, exemplifying what was an intellectual discussion last week with a very concrete case study this week. With that, Dr. Neimeic, I'll pass it on to you.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Bill, for that kind introduction and for really connecting what I'll be talking about today to your amazing work and the discussions last week. And so I'm so excited to share with you all. I'm going to share my screen again. Let's see. Yeah, so as Bill said, thank you all so much for having me here today. I direct a center. We've been around for a couple years. It's called the Animal Human Policy Center, and we conduct research on the social science related to a variety of animal protection issues. So really doing that descriptive work that Bill was talking about and trying to understand essentially what are public values towards animal protection issues. We focus a lot on wildlife, but also look at actually some farmed animal, companion animal issues as well, and trying to understand, how can public values affect public policy and how are those reflected in public policy. And so as Bill mentioned today, I'm going to dive into some very specific case studies of ballot initiatives and carnivore protection and public values and voting related to these issues. So I will go ahead and just dive right in. And so I'm sure folks here have heard about some of the research in the human dimensions of wildlife that has found that public values are shifting towards wildlife. And so studies have shown by my colleagues actually here at CSU in the Human Dimensions of Natural Resources Department that you know 40, 50 years ago, the public tended to have what's called domination values towards wildlife, where the majority of people believed wildlife was there for our use for human benefit, and that's how we should be managing wildlife. But studies have documented the shift in public values over time in the past several decades, potentially as a result of urbanization and other cultural changes towards more mutualist wildlife value orientations. And what that means is more and more people want to coexist with wildlife. They want to live with wildlife. They don't necessarily support lethal control, lethal removal of wildlife, and that they think that we should maybe coexist with carnivores. And this shift has resulted in ballot initiatives focused on policies that reflect more mutualist values towards wildlife. And the reason why folks are going to the ballot is because those folks with more mutualist values are feeling like their values are not heard in decision making. And actually, studies have shown that our wildlife management agencies in our state wildlife management agencies in the US tend to still manage for those more domination values. When you look at the values of those who work in agencies, they tend to have more domination values, which are not necessarily reflective of the growing mutualist population throughout the US. And so for mutualists to have their voices heard, they are turning to the ballot and saying, let's have the public have a say in wildlife management. Okay, so this is a little bit of a diagram that I like showing that talks about how wildlife management decisions are made. And so typically, the North American model of wildlife management, it manages for a variety of values, and those are tend to be more domination oriented values. So things like maintaining hunting, fishing, recreation, income generated towards our agencies. That's kind of a main value that we manage for interstate agencies. Also, though, maintaining ecosystems, habitats, species, populations, that's typically managed for in the North American model of wildlife management. But that shift in public values that we're seeing is not just caring about, habitats, species, populations, ecosystems, but also the welfare of individual animals. And so this is what we're seeing more and more of the public caring about, reducing suffering of individual animals, reducing killing of individual animals. But that's typically outside of those values that our state agencies manage for. So those are the sorts of values that we're seeing being heard through ballot initiatives. So when I talk about ballot initiatives, here's an example of all of the different ballot initiatives we're starting to see as mutualists want a greater say in wildlife management. And one thing to note here is that there are some ballot initiatives on the other side. So there's a backlash often within hunting communities where they're saying, no, we want to preserve more traditional ways of managing wildlife management. We want to preserve certain hunting rights. So we do see some pro-hunting related, pro-domination value related initiatives as well. But for example, going all the way back to the 90s, there were ballot initiatives in California, in Arizona, all around, banning certain types of hunting, certain types of trapping, especially around carnivores. And so black bears and also cougar hunting with dogs. And then going up to the 2000s, we start to see some attempted ballot initiatives, even in Alaska, places like North Dakota, Montana. Once again, a lot around trapping and hunting and reducing trapping and hunting around carnivores. Now we've had some of our own. I'm in Colorado, and recently we've had some of our own mutualist-oriented ballot initiatives that have happened that I think have made at least this one has made international news. And this was kind of a unique initiative because it was the first time that actually a species was reintroduced via ballot initiative. So this was in 2020, Proposition 114, which was a ballot initiative here in Colorado to reintroduce wolves into the state because we don't have a resident population of wolves, or didn't at that time. And so those with more mutualist value orientations who wanted to see carnivores on the landscape They brought this to the ballot after decades of trying to reintroduce wolves via Colorado Parks and Wildlife, not having any success of that, and knowing that the Colorado population had kind of a majority with mutualist values. They put this on the ballot, and it did end up passing only by a wee bit. And we've done a bunch of polling and studies to try to understand that I could always talk about in the Q&A. But that was an example of another ballot initiative. And then the one that I'm really going to dive in today was recently. So this was in 2024, and so this was Proposition 127, which would have prohibited bobcat, lynx, and mountain lion hunting. And this was basically kind of under any circumstance except for defending livestock or human lives. And surprisingly, I think something that surprised a lot of us is that even though the wolf reintroduction ballot initiative did pass, this initiative didn't pass. And so you could see the final results of the vote here. Only 45% of voters voted for this. And that's compared to, 50.9% of voters voting for wolf reintroduction. So it didn't end up passing in the state. And so myself, as a social scientist, one of my first questions was, why didn't this pass? And especially, when we look at some of the data in Colorado, we find that the majority of Coloradans do have more mutualist value orientations. It tends to be more of a blue state. And we found with wolf reintroduction that actually a vote for Biden was strongly correlated with wolf reintroduction. So there's kind of the political landscape to make something like this pass, but it didn't. And so one of the key questions that I had was, what is going on here? And in general, what is influencing public voting, public support for these wildlife protection and especially carnivore protection ballot initiatives that we're seeing? And are we seeing a change? So while there has been a growing body of mutualists, a growing number of mutualists, is that changing? Are people starting to change their views towards wildlife? And is that why Proposition 127 didn't pass? So my colleagues and I undertook a couple of different research studies that I'm going to report on today to answer these questions. And so the two research questions that we were particularly interested in addressing was, first, what arguments influence public support for wildlife protection ballot initiatives? And so basically, why is the public voting for or against, and especially against, wildlife protection ballot initiatives? What's influencing them? And how does message framing influence public support for wildlife protection ballot initiatives? And so is the public being influenced by certain types of messaging? And so even though they may have, say, mutualist values or political affiliations that align with wildlife protection ballot initiatives, is there certain types of messaging that's getting them to vote against these or initiatives or not support them? So the first thing that we did was a study right after Proposition 127 failed in Colorado. And we decided to do some in-person voter interviews of over 300 Colorado residents to try to understand right after they voted, why they voted for or against that initiative, and what sort of arguments influenced their vote. And then the second thing we did was we did a message framing experiment with 2,000 nationally representative residents recruited through an online panel provider. And that was to really follow up on our first study to actually experimentally look at how different message framing might influence public perspectives on carnivore protection ballot initiatives. Okay, so the first study, I'll go into that first study first. So what we did is essentially within the month after the vote on Prop 127, my team and I went out into the field and did a whole very cold road trip all throughout Colorado in the winter to interview people in person. And we did in-person interviews for a variety of reasons. I think anyone on this call who has been involved in social science, public polling, knows that there's all sorts of challenges we deal with in terms of public polling data, trying to get people to share what they think honestly, trying to get a representative sample with reduced bias, trying to reduce response rate bias, social desirability bias. There's all of these challenges. And really what we thought was, if we can just get, an intersection intercept sample of people in person, that will reduce response bias, because if we just go and ask them in person, it's much easier to answer a couple of questions in person when you're already there, than it is to go in and decide to take a survey, or answer the phone. And so we thought that would give us kind of the truest representation of what people were thinking right then and there, right after they voted on this. And so basically, we went to public locations all throughout Colorado, different areas, rural, urban areas, western slope that's more rural, where there's more carnivores that people are coexisting with, versus the Front Range here, which is more urban. So we went to all sorts of different locations. We'd stand out in front of grocery stores, post offices, all sorts of public locations, and then we would ask people if they could take just a couple minutes to talk to us about the recent election. Asked if they voted for 127, why they voted for or against it, what were their information sources. And so here's an example. Here's a comparison of our sample with voters. You can see we adjusted our sampling locations to make sure that our sample was fairly representative of the overall voting population. Okay, so what did we end up finding? So the most common reasons why people voted for 127 were generally aligned with kind of mutualist value orientations. And so people talked about how they're against sport, trophy hunting specifically. They were generally against hunting. They had positive attitudes towards animals, especially carnivores. General moral, emotional arguments like killing cats in these ways is immoral, cruel, horrible. Cats should have rights because they're native. So these are kind of the all-encompassing, kind of more mutualist value orientation related arguments. But then when we ask people why they voted against 127, something really interesting happened here, which is the reasons why people said they voted against 127 were actually not really related to the domination value orientation. They weren't really related to this idea of we should be managing animals for human benefit, or even really negative attitudes towards carnivores. We should be killing carnivores because they're dangerous, anything like that. Instead, the reasons why people were voting against Prop 127 were all related to the way decisions are made in wildlife management. And so it was more about process and governance than it was about attitudes towards carnivores. And specifically, we found the three most common arguments were that we shouldn't be voting for a proposition like 127 because we should be leaving it to the experts. We have a wildlife management agency for a reason. We pay managers to make these decisions. These kinds of decisions should be left to the wildlife biologists and experts. Relatedly, people talked about how cats are already managed. Our wildlife management agency is already managing how many cats are killed. And then third, people talked about this concept of ballot box biology. And this is this concept that the public should not make wildlife management decisions via ballot initiatives. Because wildlife management decisions should be science-based and the public does not know enough to make these decisions. And so this concept of ballot box biology, we shouldn't be doing biology, making biological decisions via ballot box, that came up a ton. And then related to that was this general trust in Colorado parks and wildlife. So you can see these are all around governance, decision-making, rather than attitudes towards cats specifically, or even benefits for people. Okay, so that really, led us to this next experiment, this next question that we had, which was just that, okay, so people said that they were voting against this initiative because of this idea of ballot box biology, trust the experts. And so that led us to this question is that really what was influencing decision making? And so it's one thing to ask people what influenced them, and then to get their response. But we all know, kind of as social scientists, that doesn't necessarily tell us if that's actually what's influencing them. And to do that, we actually need to run some experimental studies. We need to show people different messaging and see if this messaging actually results experimentally in a reduction of support. So that's what we wanted to do through our second messaging experiment. But one thing, but before I go into the details of that, I do want to talk a little bit more about this ballot box biology argument. And so ballot box biology, it was brought up by all the interviewees, and interviewees also talked about how they were most likely to get their information about the ballot initiative from news sources, from radio, podcast, social media, that sort of thing. And what was all over radio and podcasts and social media, ballot box biology arguments were. And so if people are familiar with Joe Rogan, ballot box biology arguments actually were being promoted by Joe Rogan himself, a variety of other podcasters, Lauren Boebert, a variety of other politicians. And here's some of the phrasing that was used to describe this ballot box biology idea. And so leave, management and the state's wildlife in the hands of trained professionals. Ballot box biology is threatening rural Colorado, and the people who actually have to live with carnivores. It can upend ballot box biology can upend the most successful fish and game management models the world has ever seen. And so these are the kinds of narratives that were being shared to influence people to vote against wildlife protection initiatives. Okay, so now why might these narratives be so effective? And I was thinking about this as a social scientist. I was like, why are people really latching on to this? And why is it, potentially influencing people's decision making? And this is where I started thinking, myself as a social scientist, started thinking about, okay, what theories do I know about human behavior that might explain why this messaging is so effective? And after racking my brain for a bit, talking with colleagues, I thought about what's called moral foundations theory, and it's a type of message framing theory. And moral foundations theory basically talks about how people have different, specifically conservatives versus liberals. In the US, it's a very kind of North American focused theory. They tend to have different values at the forefront of their mind when they're making decisions about potential policy. And so this theory talks about how liberals, when making decisions about potential policy, they tend to emphasize the value of reducing harm and enhancing fairness the most. These are the most important values that liberals think about when they're thinking about whether or not, for example, to vote on an initiative. Or vote for an initiative. On the other hand, conservatives, they still care about these values, but studies have shown that they also care about some additional values, things like the in-group, loyalty to the in-group, authority, paying respect to authority, purity, and so this idea of really adhering to specific ways of life that are viewed as pure, and so this is so conservatives tend to emphasize these other values. And so when I was thinking about moral foundation theory, I looked at the ballot box biology messaging again, and I said, you know what? Actually, this messaging really appeals to liberal values. And what it does is it appeals to liberal values of harm and fairness. And if we go back to some of this messaging that we see here, it's talking about how, hey, ballot box biology, these ballot initiatives to protect carnivores, they are harming rural Colorado. So that is a framing to liberal values right there of harm. And ballot box biology is unfair. It is basically one of the messages that's common among it is it's talking about how it's allowing the majority that doesn't have to live with carnivores to impose their values on the minority who does have to live with carnivores, and how that is deeply unfair. And so right there, we have two of the strongest moral foundations that liberals use for making decision making that's being appealed to through this messaging. The other thing that it does that might be particularly effective is it appeals to liberal trust in scientific experts. And so there's been a variety of studies that I'm sure many folks are aware of, that have shown that liberals tend to have higher trust in institutions and scientists, in experts, in agencies. And so what this ballot box biology messaging was doing is it was basically saying, trust our institutions. It was exactly appealing to that liberal value by saying trust the institutions, trust the scientists. And so this may be why it was so effective in a liberal state like Colorado, where people tend to vote on party lines. And in the past, past, we found that, liberals were voting for carnivore protection initiatives, but then, they got this ballot box biology messaging, which specifically appealed to liberal values, which then reduced liberals' support and Coloradan support in general for carnivore protection ballot initiatives. So that was part of my hypothesis going into this research, that basically the opposition, those with domination values, they crafted this messaging specifically to appeal to the more liberal population here in Colorado and appealed to their values quite effectively. Okay, and then one thing that I will mention is there has been research that has shown that this sort of message framing, so reframing messages to appeal to these different moral foundations, can actually change people's levels of support for environmental causes. And so this was a study actually by one of my PhD advisors way back in the day. And that actually showed that if we reframed news articles about environmental causes, and instead of, this was actually in the opposite direction of what we're talking about with ballot box biology messaging, but if we reframed, harm care focused messaging around environmental issues, and instead reframe that to talk about loyalty or even purity, that's an easy one to frame environmental issues after, don't make our lakes or our air dirty, then that can increase conservative support for environmental issues. So this gives us some initial evidence that this sort of message framing may be highly effective, but in our case, it's going in the case we're talking about right now, it's going in the opposite direction of, more conservative, domination value oriented folks reframing messages to appeal to liberals to vote against wildlife protection initiatives. So our second study went to experimentally test this through an online panel provider sample. And so we looked at two different research questions. The first was, to what extent does ballot box biology messaging reduce support for carnivore protection ballot initiatives? And then, does pro-carnivore ballot initiative messaging that appeals to liberal moral foundations of fairness and trust in experts increase support for ballot initiatives? So our second question there was, okay, so if ballot box biology is so effective at appealing to liberal values, can we craft messages that appeal to liberal values that do support carnivore protection initiatives? And are those effective at then enhancing support for carnivore protection initiatives? So we recruited 2,000 demographically and politically representative survey responses via Prolific Survey Company, and I can talk a little bit more after trying a bunch of different survey recruitment companies why we went with Prolific for this one. We randomized one of 5 pro and anti ballot initiative messages, plus a no message control. And then after that respondents received that message, we asked them about a variety of questions. And so first, our primary outcomes, we're looking at level of support for and likelihood of engaging in action to promote carnivore protection ballot initiatives. And our secondary outcomes were beliefs about ballot initiatives and public engagement. So we wanted to know how all of this different messaging influences those outcomes. So we tested, these were the 4 different, we tested one, anti-carnivore protection ballot initiative messaging, and that was the ballot box biology messaging. And we basically took directly from all of the different news articles on it. And then we tested 4 pro carnivore protection ballot initiative messages that we developed that were specifically designed to try to appeal to those liberal moral foundations and trust in experts. So I'll go through all the messaging right now and then provide some results before I wrap up here. So I'll just mention really quickly, before we provided any of this additional messages about ballot initiatives, we did provide all participants with information on how carnivores are currently managed, what they're allowed, what hunting is allowed, how folks currently hunt carnivores. So people were educated kind of on the issues before given messaging. This was our negative ballot box biology messaging. So this was the messaging that we used against carnivore protection ballot initiatives. And so you can see here all of those narratives that I was talking about. It's ballot box biology is creating challenges for wildlife management. It's overriding the experts. It hands things over to the public. People vote based on emotions rather than facts. And then the fairness argument, it enables the urban majority to override the perspectives of those in rural areas who are truly knowledgeable about living with wildlife. Then these are our pro carnivore protection messages. And so the first was kind of a baseline message. And what this baseline message did is it said, actually, wildlife management decisions, and I'm sure Bill, I hopefully you all have heard Bill talk about this many times before. So this message really talked about, wildlife management decisions. Actually, they're made at the intersection of both biology and public values. Wildlife management decisions are essentially value-based. And so this is why it's so important to get public input, because we are making decisions of what we want to see based on values. And then the biology comes in to help us figure out how to manage to achieve those values. And so it was some baseline public education on, hey, wildlife management is not just about biology. It's a little bit more complex than that. And that's why we need public input. We then added a moral foundations framing, and this is where we tried to flip things and frame to liberal values of fairness, but frame it in a way that it would hopefully increase support for carnivore protection ballot initiatives, or that was our hypothesis. And so this moral foundations framing basically highlighted how decision making within the North American model of wildlife management hasn't always been fair. So it appealed to that fairness moral foundation. And essentially it talked about how, hey, certain stakeholders, those, for example, sportsmen, those with hunting and fishing licenses, have been prioritized throughout the centuries, and their values are typically the ones that are heard in wildlife decision making rather than the general public, and rather than the public who's changing their values towards management. And right now it's very difficult for those other values, those mutualist values, to be heard in wildlife management because the process is not fair. So this message was trying to show about the importance of public input by framing to liberal fairness moral foundations. And then finally, we added on to that what we called an expert clarification message. And this was also meant to appeal to liberals by appeal to liberal trust in experts by demonstrating that those making decisions, the ultimate policy decisions about wildlife management, those aren't actually scientific experts. And so this message talked about how, most state wildlife management decisions are made by a governor-appointed wildlife commission, board, or council, of which 75% of members are representatives from hunting, fishing, and agricultural industries. And really, the way decisions are made about wildlife is just as much about politics than it is about expertise. And so this was really trying to appeal to liberals' trust in experts by saying, hey, the experts who you think are making the decisions are not actually the ones who are making decisions. So we can't just trust the experts, because decisions are being made by political appointees and stakeholders with certain values rather than experts. So that was the addition of the expert clarification message. And then really quickly, our outcome variables, just a reminder. So we were trying to look at the extent to which these messages influenced a variety of different things. The first was level of support for ballot initiatives to protect carnivores. And so here was a list of all the different potential carnivore protection ballot initiatives that we asked people about. And we took the average of that because they were all very highly correlated. And that was one of our outcome variables. And then our other outcome variable was likelihood of engaging in actions to support greater protections of carnivores. We took the average of that as well. So those were our two main outcome measures, where we looked at how does the different messaging influence these outcomes. And what you could see is actually in our sample, they were pretty supportive already. The majority were already fairly supportive of ballot initiatives to protect carnivores in these ways. And then we also asked about a variety of secondary outcomes, which were all beliefs around ballot initiatives more broadly. So ballot initiatives, ensure more equal representation of voices in wildlife management. They ensure a greater say in wildlife management, or on the flip side, they cause more harm than good. Okay, so what did we find? So the first thing that we found through this messaging experiment was that ballot box biology messaging significantly reduced average support for ballot initiatives to protect carnivores. And so this is overall support. What we can see here is actually none of our other messages, the pro carnivore protection ballot measures, pro carnivore protection messages. None of those increased overall support compared to a no message control, but ballot box biology significantly decreased support. So this would support our findings out in the field. When we asked voters what was influencing their decision making, they said ballot box biology messaging. Now we have experimental evidence suggesting that indeed it does reduce support for carnivore protection ballot initiatives. And as I mentioned, none of the other messages that we put together that were focused on appealing to liberal values increased support for ballot initiatives to protect carnivores compared to a no message control. Although that being said, if you remember those numbers from a couple slides back, support was already fairly high. And so we may be up against like a ceiling effect here, where basically the level of support we are going to get, we got already. Okay. But then we did find that both pro and anti-ballot initiative messages impacted our secondary belief outcomes. So impacted beliefs around ballot initiatives in general. And so I'll give a few examples of this. So this is our outcome of ballot initiatives to protect native carnivores, ensure more equal representation of voices in wildlife management. Our ballot box biology message reduced the belief in that. So our ballot box biology message made people believe that it doesn't lead to more equal representation, while our moral foundations and expert clarification messages increase the belief that ballot initiatives to protect native carnivores ensure more equal representation of voices. So that message did have an impact on what people think about ballot initiatives. Same with this belief, this belief that wildlife management decisions should be left to the experts. Unexpectedly, ballot box biology messaging significantly increased that belief that decisions should be left to the experts, but our moral foundations plus expert clarification message that significantly decreased the belief. And so this is suggesting that that message is starting to have an impact, not on the end result of overall public support for initiatives, but on some of these beliefs around initiatives. And the last one here is the belief that the public should have a greater say in wildlife management than it currently does. Unexpectedly, ballot box biology messaging decreased that, but our moral foundations and expert clarification messaging increased that, as well as our moral foundations messaging alone. And notice that baseline messaging that just talked about, how wildlife management is really kind of this intersection between values and biology. Notice that hasn't really influenced anything, and if anything, it has kind of a negative influence on this one belief. And so that to me tells me that if folks are trying to increase public support for carnivore protection initiatives, adding those moral foundations and especially that expert clarification language is really critical. Those are critical pieces for influencing public beliefs on decision-making processes. Okay, so last couple slides here, overview of some of our key findings. The first thing we found through all of this is that ballot box biology messaging is indeed reducing public support for carnivore protection ballot initiatives. And it's likely effective at reducing support because it appeals to liberal moral foundations of harm, fairness, and trust in institutions and experts. And then the question we had was, can pro-carnivore protection messages be reframed to appeal to liberal moral foundations of fairness and trust in experts? And can these messages increase support for ballot initiatives? We found mixed results on this. We found that reframing of, pro-carnivore protection messages, especially to talk about experts and who are the experts making decisions, can change some beliefs around the importance of public opinion, around why ballot initiatives may be important, but we didn't find evidence to increase support for carnivore protection ballot initiatives. But if we're going to take anything from those pro-carnivore messages we crafted, that focus on expert clarification seemed to be particularly effective. And so really clarifying that the experts, the people who are ultimately making the decision of how we manage wildlife, how many carnivores we kill, for example, those are not the biologists, those are political appointees. Okay, so what next? So I think some key takeaways from all of this is just that, the success of future pro-carnivore protection Ballot initiatives is really going to depend on the extent to which folks working on those can combat ballot box biology narratives. I think, without some public education and significant messaging around this ballot box biology narrative, I think more and more people will be convinced to vote against carnivore protection or other wildlife protection initiatives. Additional research is needed on how to combat these narratives. I think we started finding maybe a kernel of truth in that expert clarification messaging. But I think really what our results show is that we need a lot more research on that. And how do we really tell that story of who are the experts making decisions? What are the decisions, and what are the decisions the public should be providing input into? And what are the things that should be left to those biologists? And then finally, we just need some public education on the role of values versus biological science in decision making, what values are currently considered, and why it's important to consider those additional values, as Bill was talking about at the beginning of this and in the introduction. One of the things I found really interesting about doing this work when I was out in the field interviewing voters around 127 after the vote, some of the youngest voters who were also wildlife biology majors at CSU, where I work, those were the people who were most opposed to Prop 127. They were most opposed to ballot initiatives. And to me, that was telling me they're getting an education around wildlife management that is convincing them that the public should not have a say. And these are the folks who are being educated. They're going to school for this, and they were the most adamant against 127. So that tells me, even in our universities, that's really a place where we need to start combating this false narrative of ballot box biology. Okay, so maybe I'll end there. And sorry, I only left 10 minutes for questions, but I will take any questions.
Becky, just as a reminder, we do go until 3:30 Central if you have time. So there's a bit more time for questions if that
Okay.
works for you. Yeah.
Cool.
Okay. Uh, Pamela, I think Emma, you were first.
I think so.
Yeah.
Sorry, the sun is coming through my window, so I look a little weird. But thanks so much for this presentation. It was really, really interesting. I am also in Colorado, so very familiar with the examples you provided. Um, and hopefully I can make this question clear, but I was thinking about the presentation about ethics, last week? I think I watched the recording yesterday. Um, and I was thinking about how if we might consider ballot initiatives kind of like the polls we were talking about, or Bill, that you were talking about in the last presentation about how it's kind of um, instead of having like a dialogic approach where it's kind of surveying people and asking, okay, who wants what, and then kind of managing from there instead of having a more dialogic approach. Because these are things that I grappled with as well. I think one interesting example is like with the wolf reintroduction, right? Like I voted for it and it put a certain time limit on it, right? So it put these restrictions on CPW and on the folks who were actually implementing it that may have not been the most helpful or the best decision to make if we're actually thinking about like effective restoration. So I'm curious if in thinking about ballot initiatives, if we could potentially expand what public participation looks like, right? So are ballot initiatives kind of the best way to get the public involved? Because I agree, right? Like it should be the public and experts or people who have certain knowledge in various capacities. But are ballot initiatives the best way to do that? Are they the best way to do that in our current system and framework? Or should we strive for something that's less of kind of a poll and less dialogic? Because I would argue that the ballot is not dialogic at all. Sorry, that was a lot, but hopefully that makes sense.
No, That's an awesome question. I love it. And I have the same problem with like coming in. It's that time of day. Yes, and I guess we're in the same state here. Yeah, so I love that question. I think it's a critical question. And I think there's a lot of there's a lot of efforts among certain state fish and wildlife agencies to try to reform and to try to reform in response to changing public values, look for alternative sources of revenue, engage in more intensive public participation processes, and so reform their commissions. We've actually had a lot of success here in Colorado of reforming our commission. So we actually do have scientists on our commission, which is rare, and so I think, and so I think that, that work is critical. And I think that work is ideal, which is to make sure that our agencies align with the diversity and prevalence of different public values and incorporate those. And so I would agree with you. I think that would absolutely be the ideal approach, and have kind of deliberative democratic decision making run by our agencies. And so, yes, I'm there with you. I think that would reduce conflict as well. We see how these ballot initiatives escalate conflict over issues, and that escalating conflict can increase rural urban divides and increase hatred towards wildlife. So yes, absolutely. I'm right there with you. So I'll say that first. I think the second thing I'll say is just that I think a lot of people advocates go to ballot initiatives because they felt like they had been advocating for like 50 years for this thing, and they felt like they weren't involved in decision making. They try to go to the legislator. If you're in a red state, there's like no way to get anything passed through the legislature, around wildlife protection. There's no way to, have commission reform if it's not top down from a really progressive governor like what we have here in Colorado, and so I think there's like and sometimes like hoping for someone to come into an agency and massively reform it. There's a cultural problem, and you really need some really brave leadership, which is quite rare, I think. And so I think, there's a lot of barriers there, if that makes sense, for making that ideal vision happen. And so I think that's why a lot of advocates end up going to ballot initiatives, because they're like, hey, we tried rules, we tried the commission, going through the commission, we tried going directly to the agency, we tried protests, we tried the legislator, we tried it all. And so all we have left as a tool to be heard is the ballot initiative. And so I think that's where that's where we were kind of approaching some of this research is, if this is your only tool left, then but then the public gets swayed to vote against their values by what I would consider misleading messaging, then you're really in a tough spot, because then the one tool you have left to be heard will not work, if that makes sense. And so I think, but yeah, I think it's a great point. And I think, Wildlife for All is doing some really neat work on commission reforms. And I think, and I know other organizations are as well. I know Pan Works and other groups in the space. And so I think, I think that work is absolutely critical. And in an ideal world, everyone will feel representative and initiatives won't be needed.
Exactly. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Pamela?
Yes, I am mostly familiar with the wildlife wars in Idaho, and I was doing some research online about a couple of the high-profile wolf haters and trappers in Idaho, and stumbled across an interview. And I'm afraid this just has to be anecdotal because I don't remember the name of the woman or the organization or even the podcast I was listening to, but she was talking about Proposition 127, and she obviously was the opposition to it. And she attributed the defeat of the proposal to having trophy hunting struck. And I'm not sure if that was from the title of the ballot initiative or the text or both. But that was her take on it, was that was what really made the difference. And I just wondered what you know about that and why that language would have been struck. That's it.
Yeah, I think It's interesting. I think, I think it's a great question. Here was the ultimate language of the initiative. And so I'm glad I had this up. But I think like what's interesting about that hypothesis that it was just like not the word trophy hunting, I think like um, that's not necessarily what our data supports, if that makes sense. Like I think if that was the reason why people were voting against 127 is because they thought, they were concerned just about trophy hunting, then, you would expect to see it kind of turn up here as the reasons why they voted against, which is to say this is not trophy hunting, this is this is reasonable hunting. And instead, the main reasons were around leaving it to the experts, ballot box biology, that sort of thing. So my guess is, if this language had been a bit clearer around trophy hunting, like a yes vote would make it illegal to trophy hunt, maybe a few more people would have voted for it, if that makes sense. But it still wouldn't have combated the ballot box biology narrative, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Which I think would have, yeah, would have still defeated it. But I think it's, yeah, I think I mean, there was all these debates too, where, the opposition would come back and be like, well, it's not trophy hunting because technically by Colorado law, you have to eat the mountain lion. Like, is anyone enforcing that? Are people actually eating the mountain lions they kill? Probably not. And so I think, so, but that became a whole thing. And I know from doing a media analysis in the news, they would often emphasize that in counter to the trophy hunting, this is trophy hunting. They would then share, well, by law, it technically can't be trophy hunting. So that was another part of the narrative. But I think it's a great point. I'm really glad you brought that up.
Okay. Well, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Bernat, I think you're next. I hope I pronounced it correctly.
Yeah, you did. Hi, thank you. This is a fascinating work. I had a question. So, did you notice any other groups, like other than liberal and conservative, um, that like drive values that might need attention um, in the future research? Um, I mean, if you can group people in anything else other than the two groups that you used, if that makes sense. And it was really
Yeah.
interesting. This work is really relevant to my PhD dissertation, so I'm really glad I joined. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you. Yeah, it's a great question of what else drives people's voting and decision making. And we've done a lot of different studies and are looking at kind of the most common drivers. And often it will be, things like hunting. And I'm thinking across not just with 127, but across a wide range of studies we did on the vote for wolf reintroduction and general support of carnivore initiatives and all sorts of things. And, you know, of, what I would say is identity variables do tend to predict support, and so things like and demographics, often education, often rural urban areas where people live, often not just their own identity as a hunter or rancher or animal advocate or environmentalist, but whether they know people in their social network who fit within those identities. That tends to be a predictor as well. And then, but what's super interesting to me is that when we did an analysis for example, the vote on wolf reintroduction on Prop 114, we actually did a precinct level analysis looking at kind of the drivers of precinct level voting, and we found that political party affiliation, specifically vote for the presidential candidate, was a stronger predictor by far than any of those other identity variables for vote on wolf reintroduction, and so I think that kind of suggests, while those other identity variables matter, as something maybe gets on the ballot, becomes politicized in some other way, really that political party identification is really important. Another thing that we often find, mutualists, like with this study, our messaging study, one of the biggest predictors of support for pro-carnivore ballot initiatives was mutualist versus domination values. And so that was a really strong predictor. And then another thing we consistently find is perceptions of social norms. And often those perceptions of social norms are stronger predictors than any of the identity variables themselves. And so with the messaging study, we just asked basically like what percentage of Americans do you think would support carnivore protection and ballot initiatives? And basically that was an extremely strong predictor as well. And so we've consistently identified something called pluralistic ignorance in these studies, which is that people tend to underestimate the level of support there is for carnivore protection initiatives. And so, if you saw those numbers, the support was between like 60 and 70%, support for carnivore protection initiatives. Typically, when we ask people, what do you think is the level of support? The average perceived level of support is below 50%. So people are underestimating level of support, and that can influence their own support as well. And so, so it's interesting that I guess in today's world, really, it's this kind of perception of what others are doing and your own political party affiliation that seems to be overriding some of those other variables we might think might be most important.
Harry, I believe you're up next.
Thanks, Bernie. Thank you for this presentation. It's been really interesting. I'm just curious, though, when you put your first slide up, I thought, well, of course they didn't vote for this. And I wondered how, when you did your messaging survey, how you factored out for bias and I guess what I would call the fact that we tend to, for cats, we tend to negatively see them more so than dogs. And I know wolves and cougars are not dogs and cats, right? But for anyone who has a feline and tries to travel across the country and stay in a hotel, in a pet-friendly hotel, that pet-friendly soon becomes obvious that it's just for dogs. So did you look at that at all when you were doing this questioning? Because it seems like that's in the back of people's head, that it's just very simple whether they relate to cats or dogs, and how that would maybe cross the boundary into wolves and the bigger cats. And I hope that made sense.
Yeah. I mean, I think, well, a couple thoughts in response to this. I think, you know, we would expect if people didn't vote for this because they didn't care about cats, they didn't like cats, then it would come up in their responses, right? And so you would think they would basically say something like, yeah, I'm not really involved in this issue. I don't really care about it. I don't really care about cats. I don't know much about cats, or I'm scared of cats, any sort of thing indicating a negative attitude towards cats. And those did come up, but it was much, much, much less common than these are the top 5 arguments that came up. And so I think, I think there's an aspect of this of like that's honestly what I expected. Like when I was asking people why did you not vote for 127, I thought people would be like, well, mountain lions are scary, or like I don't know that much about them, might as well hunt them, I don't really care about them. And so but instead people had these very specific arguments that they were sharing first. And so I think my first reaction to that is I think it's a great hypothesis. I think that people can follow up and do studies to look at like, the difference between carnivore and cat protect, or sorry, dog versus cat protection initiative. So wolves and coyotes versus mountain lions, bobcats, and see if there's a difference there. Although I haven't really seen that much of a difference in the data that I've looked at before. And then look at messaging around cats versus messaging around canines and see if there's a difference. But what's interesting is that didn't show up in our results. It didn't show up in our data. I will say the one thing that did show up is we asked people if they would have changed their vote. I wish I had these slides. Sorry, I don't currently. But we asked people if they would have changed their votes if 127 was only focused on banning trapping of bobcats for fur or hunting of mountain lions with dogs. And the hypothesis there was that maybe it was this idea of a blanket ban, and that really fed into this ballot box biology narrative because people are saying, well, well, we shouldn't ban it like all hunting, but maybe they'd be more supportive of banning very specific practices of reasons to hunt or ways of hunting that are seen as particularly egregious by a large percentage of the public. And what we did find from that is I think it was around 20% or so said that who voted against 127 said that they would have voted for 127 if it was only focused on trapping bobcats for fur or only focused on hunting of mountain lions with dogs. And so that would suggest it would have passed if it was focused more narrowly on banning types of hunting or reasons for hunting. And so that I think is another component of this as well. You know, you bring up the important point of what species are we talking about and what are people's connections to these species, but there's also the point of you know, what are we actually banning and how does that play into the level of public support?
Thank you. That's interesting.
Of course. Thanks for your question.
Jid, I believe you're up next.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I think you answered part of my question just now, which is, the types of hunting. And this question is kind of tangential, which is, in any of your work, have you noticed a shift in attitudes with graphical representations of the issue versus textual, right? So if you talk about leg hold traps or wolf whacking, I think one of the descriptions on your slides talked about, hitting an animal with an ATV or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen a shift if you got graphical evidence, so like images or videos of the suffering really, that kind of you backs up what is described in the text, because text is one step removed, right? And so it's not one of our primary senses. If you visually see what is actually happening on the ground, does that change people's attitudes in any way? Have you noticed that in any of your work?
Yeah, I mean it's a great question. I haven't specifically studied it through messaging experiments, but it absolutely needs to be done. And I was just on a call with someone who does this work a few days ago who wants to run some visual based messaging experiments as well. So I think and I think what's really cool is you could design the like visual and video videos to appeal to some of the like framing that we talked about before, like, and so I know some of those original studies on, like, for example, going up to the Willer and Feinberg study, they looked at I don't know if it was in this exact study or one of their follow-ups, but they actually thought about kind of representations of what purity values might look like from a visual perspective. And so it's this idea of like harm care that might be like focused on like a dying animal or a dying forest or whatever, versus like the visual of like a factory polluting and the clouds of pollution into the air and into the water. That's an image that's more focused on that particular purity value that would appeal to conservative moral foundations. And so I think there's definitely some baseline kind of literature supporting that concept, that we can play with visuals, we can play with videos to appeal to that. We started with text because we wanted because it's the like foundation of it, if that makes sense. Like we wanted to start with like, does this language even influence us? And then if it influences us, how do we create videos and how do we create imagery around it? But you're right, like maybe the language is just not engaging enough to people, and so maybe we should have to start with visuals first and then go from there. But yeah, but I think, and also I think we started with text because the ballot box biology messaging, that was all kind of like text, that was all text based, right? And so I think and and often they will show like a scary mountain lion in the background or something, but but the main argument was all around the narrative rather than the visual. But I think there's a lot of work to be done in that space, so it's an excellent question.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you all for your questions, and Becky for answering all of them.
Absolutely, such wonderful questions. Thanks for being such a great engaged audience.
Can I follow up with a question too?
Yeah.
Please.
I was thinking, I've been listening to, as I've been tracking the wolf reintroduction in Colorado, I've been listening to podcasts and reading local news. And one of the pieces that comes out is a very sharp critique of the intercept sampling methodology that was undertaken for the first stage here, with the claim that because it didn't specifically gather information from hunters and trappers and guides, that therefore it was incomplete. Um, and I'm wondering how you respond. I don't know whether you've heard that or not, but I'm wondering how you might be responding to that kind of claim.
Yeah. And was that and about this study or about just general intercept sampling
This was about the use of intercept sampling
in
in
general?
this particular study.
Oh, in this particular study. Well, the purpose for this particular study, our research question was essentially for the general public who was voting on this. What were the reasons why they voted for or against it? So our intercept sampling methodology was designed at trying to get a random sample essentially of the general public. And so, there will be some hunters in it. There will be some trappers in it, but we weren't trying to understand like the research. We were trying to create a representative sample of hunters or of trappers, if that makes sense. We were trying to mimic the voting population essentially. And so going to a combination of rural, urban locations, public places that everyone uses, post office, grocery store in a small town, all of that, that we thought would give us the best representation of the general public who did vote, if that makes sense. So that was, yeah. And I think I've heard that critique before, like for all of our polls, and it's like, well, why didn't you specifically try to find, ranchers, specifically try to find hunters, and I was like, and for me, I'm like, well, if our research question was what do hunters or ranchers think about this, then we would
Yeah.
go and specifically try to find them. But our
Right,
research
right.
question was what does the public think about this? And hunters and ranchers and hunters will be a portion of that public as randomly determined through a sampling of the broader public. So I think, yeah, I think it's a great question. I appreciate you asking it. And I think a lot of that is, the classic, what is the question we were trying to answer and matching that methodology to the question.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Let me ask a follow-up to that. Then there was this really interesting question that was raised about whether the word trophy hunting, if it had been included in the original initiative, would make a difference. And your findings that those, when asked if the proposed ballot initiative was narrowed to two particular brands of hunting with dogs and leg hold trapping of for fur for bobcats, I think it was.
Any trapping. Yeah.
Any trapping, that would have made a huge difference in
Yeah.
the pluralities who would be willing to vote
Totally.
for that. Now, one of the arguments there is that, well, this is much more specific. It's not a total ban, and you articulated that. But what I'm interested in is how the moral foundations question might inform why those people said, yes, I would have been more willing to vote for such legislation. Do you have thoughts on that? I know I'm springing this on you, but do
Yeah.
you have thoughts on that?
I love that question. I think it's a fascinating question, and I assume I can give you a few rambling thoughts, and then if you have any, Bill, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I think so. If we dissect a couple of different moral foundations from the fairness perspective, I think that plays into it a little bit because this idea of, well, it's not fair to tell rural people they could never kill a mountain lion, that seems unfair. But it does seem fair to be like, don't use these methods of hunting. So because you're not saying rural people you can't do this thing, you're just saying don't do this super egregious way of killing this thing. And second of all, it appeals to the fairness, actually highlighting the kind of unfair hunting practices that are used also appeals to the fairness foundation, if that makes sense. And so I think that argument around hunting with dogs is actually it's not a fair way of hunting, it's not like person versus animal. It's person and a pack of dogs scaring the animal and a rifle against the animal, and so it's not fair chase. And so I think that also appeals to that, if that makes sense. And so that's one component I have. And then I think the like trust in experts plays into this as well, because I think, it's easy to be like a blanket ban is not trusting the experts. Like there's got to be hunting for a reason. This is the general public thinking in response to ballot box biology messaging. I think they're like, well, our experts allow hunting. So hunting has to be allowed for a reason if the experts allow it, if that makes sense. And so I think it's easier to write off a blanket ban by being like, well, this is clearly completely going against what the experts are doing, if that makes sense, versus,
Hmm.
if you say, hey, no, this very specific method of killing, or killing for fur trade or killing for economic purposes, is
Hmm.
banned. Don't worry, the experts are still determining how many animals can be killed and all that kind of stuff. So I think it kind of it lessens that clash with
Hmm.
experts as well too. So that would be my first two
Interesting.
reactions to your
Interesting.
fascinating
Yeah.
question. But yeah, what do
Yeah.
you think?
Well, again, I think I really appreciate both those answers, and they resonate with, my dim thoughts on that. But I also think that these ethical issues and the trade-offs and hard cases are really complex.
Hmm.
And by really focusing on very specific case-based discussions,
Hmm.
people have more opportunity to make a clear moral decision on
Yeah.
their own part about
Hmm.
what they think. Whereas a very broad blanket ban has so many ethical issues involved
Hmm.
that it's difficult to parse them out along the ways
Absolutely.
that you just articulated.
Yeah. Hmm.
So, yeah,
I like that
yeah,
framing that it becomes the fact that it's a moral ethical question is clearer the narrower you get it. And so yeah, I love
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah. Thanks.
Awesome. Yeah,
Appreciate it.
absolutely.
Harry, I know you raised your hand first for another question, and then Fred.
Okay, thanks. I think what I'm going to say probably will dovetail with what Fred might be bringing up, but I live in a state that that recently is discussing whether to move wolves to Colorado. So I wonder what the fairness is for animals. How do we the moral fairness for animals? How do we determine that? Because in Washington State, where I live, our states have not been delisted. They're still listed as endangered. We have a 9% population decline and a 25% drop in breeding pairs. So while I applaud Colorado trying to reintroduce wolves, how is it fair? How do we make sure that it's fair for the wolves? I guess is what I'm trying to get to. And I don't know, Fred, if that's what you were going to bring up or not, but
No, but it's a good question.
I love that question. It's a great one, and I spend a lot of time with Mark Beckoff, who I know advocates for that perspective a lot, and I think it's a really important perspective of the experiences of the individual wolves. And in Colorado, thus far, those experiences have not been great. And so a lot, our one of our first packs, we recaptured the entire pack, put them in captivity. A couple of them, one got illegally shot, several have gotten shot in Wyoming. And so, they are being brought into a really difficult life here. And so, and I would say my personal opinion is that, bringing the wolves over from Canada, that made me feel a little bit more comfortable from an individual animal perspective, because those wolves were those wolves basically had a pretty high probability of being hunted in the Canadian hunting season for wolves. And so I think that should be a critical consideration in wildlife management decisions. If we're thinking about the individuals, what is the likelihood of them passing, of them dying versus living a successful life where they were before versus where they're being reintroduced? That's a value, and I think that's a value that's really important to consider in decision making. And that's not even getting into in Colorado, was a couple of the wolves that then formed the pack here that engaged in a variety of different depredations and then had to be recaptured. Those wolves actually had a history of depredation in Oregon. And so then we're bringing over wolves with a depredation history into Colorado, who then continue to depredate. And so then, and then they're set up for failure, those individuals, and so I think I think it's a great question, and I would hope to see that in future participatory decision-making processes of where is the wolf in the room in terms of what that individual wolf wants. And I think that is, I think that question is critical. And I think there are some situations in which maybe that wolf would want to come to Colorado if they're going to be killed anyway. But trying to focus in on those situations may help achieve more of a win-win in terms of achieving both biodiversity outcomes and individual animal outcomes. So I'm glad you brought it up.
Thank you. If you're not doing anything tomorrow at 8:30, I have a commission meeting you could attend.
Awesome.
I just wanted to go in and say we have just a few minutes left, so maybe Fred, you could be our last question for today.
Well, I was going to bring up the Washington Wolves also, Terry, that it's not available to have the discussion now, but it's going to be a wonderful case study for many reasons. But it really, the connection to the experts is really of question in that one. But I was also going to bring up that, besides like the case studies, Bill, to look at, the words themselves are so important. And especially in these ballot box questions. So, for example, in Proposition 127, the word regulated is, I found, casual observation is such a difference. If you had asked in 127 if a no vote would continue to allow the hunting of bobcats and mountain lions as it is currently allowed by law, I bet you would have got a swing of at least several points. And if he just said is allowed, is continued to be allowed, you would get. So the words become so critical. And, another kind of direction to go is to think about there's these words that are like red flags that have ties to moral understanding, whether that understanding is even kind of recognized, but they are. So regulated is this tie to trust the experts. What is fair chase is tied again primarily historically to the experts, but now because it's being promoted primarily to the North American model and hunters, it's being questioned, and the moral complexity gets more difficult. So it might be really a fun exercise to kind of think about what are these words that kind of are salient or hidden proxies for moral values, and to think about using those words carefully or having discussions around those words. But the Washington situation is, really critically important because, again, I'm hesitating to say this online, but it gets even more complicated because of the fact that there's tribes in Washington, the Colville Federated Tribes, that currently, because of tribal rights, hunt wolves in Washington, and they kill about 20 animals a year. And so those animals could be removed and sent to Colorado. And because, like you said, Rebecca, in British Columbia, a lot of those wolves were going to be killed anyway. So again, your moral balance kind of changes.
Yeah.
And one last one, sorry, I'm rambling now, but I'm changing subjects again. Another one that really needs to understand the understanding is the phrase balance of nature, because often removing animals is considered like a balance of nature, which really doesn't exist to begin with. And so that's one where morality and understanding gets mixed and confused in the words. But Rebecca, great study. Thank you so much for presenting today. It was really, really valuable.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Fred. I appreciate all those reflections. And yeah, you're right. I mean, looking at this, like regulated by the state, links are already legal. Just the way that this is written makes it seem like, yeah, we already know what we're doing, or you could make this all illegal. Yeah, so it's pretty powerful. Awesome. Thank you all so much for having me here today. I really, really appreciate this opportunity and all this great discussion afterwards. So really, thank you.
Thank you, Becky, for taking the time to be here today and to prepare today's presentation. And thank you once again, everyone, for attending our session. We'll be preparing more for next semester, so stay tuned for additional news on those. And be sure to attend our conservation education workshop next week. Thank you all so much.